So let's get started with today's clinical topic. Our speaker today is my colleague here at Glidewell, Dr. Justin Chi. He's the Director of Clinical Technologies here. And in addition to being a very accomplished clinician, he's also a skilled dental technician and a very popular speaker. Today, he's continuing his new series, Thoroughly Reviewing Digital Dentistry. And just as a quick review, part one, and all of these lectures are archived on our website, so you can review them if you'd like. Part one was tooth preparation, tissue management, and restorative materials. Part two was tooth preparation and soft tissue management. Part three was digital impressions. And part four today is crown design. So we're going to let Dr. Chi take it away and show us a little bit about how to design a crown. It's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Park. Thank you to our business advisory panel, and thank you all for tuning in. Good morning, and I hope you all are doing well. I'm going to share my presentation here. As Dr. Park reviewed, we went through tooth preparation, part 1 and 2, digital impressions in part 3, and today we are focused on design, my favorite part. So the objectives for today, and this is more to serve as a reminder to myself of what I need to mention. So we're going to discuss the functional and aesthetic aspects of restoration design, visualizing your preparation and the impacts it has to your design. We're going to try to understand the long axis of your preparation and the adjacent teeth, basically the path of insertion, and how your design and contacts are impacted by that, and how it would influence the insertion with your patient for the seating of your restorations. And then we'll review material thickness and a few other aspects of the digital design. I'll review first a checklist that I like to establish as I move through these cases. So we're going to cover 3 posterior cases after this, and if we have time, an anterior case. So we like to try to focus on function, form, then aesthetics. Form will follow the function. The form and the shape of our designs and restorations need to be related to our restoration's primary function, which is to serve our patients, improve their chewing efficiency, certainly holding the space, and speech as well. We're going to focus mostly on posterior today, and then the aesthetics really fall in line with those key criteria. I like to think about establishing the position of the occlusion for optimal chewing efficiency for our patients for that individualized tooth. Most of what we do is one tooth at a time. So we're going to start off with a more straightforward approach with these single units. So chewing efficiency and occlusal stability, trying to maximize the areas of contact to distribute the forces with whatever teeth are opposing our design, taking into consideration the cusp-fossa relationship with our restoration design and the opposing. Can we establish an optimal cusp-fossa relationship and that maxillary mandibular displacement? So trying to avoid an edge-to-edge. If it is a crossbite situation, just establishing the right positions of those functional areas. Then we want to establish the points of contact with the adjacent teeth. We want to try to avoid pinpoint contacts. More broad contacts is going to help avoid food traps. And certainly that's primarily the reason we want to have nice stability for our restoration. More open space means potential for greater food trap and discomfort for our patients. So we're looking at that contact in a couple of dimensions, buccal to lingual and occlusal gingival. And then taking into consideration as well the marginal ridge heights of our design. From that point, we want to also establish rounded occlusal embrasures. I often see some designs where that marginal ridge is a very sharp transition from the proximal to occlusal surface. We want to try to open those areas up. It's going to allow for our patients to clean those areas better. It's more floss friendly. Floss can seek out that interproximal contact much easier rather than having a really tight contact at the occlusal. Then once we establish the proximal contacts, occlusal contacts, then we want to take into consideration the emergence profile. How is our design emerging from the soft tissue? And then from that point, aesthetic harmony. These are aspects that we want to visualize. Does our design harmonize with the surrounding dentition? Does it flow well with the surrounding dentition, especially once we move more into the aesthetic zone, premolars forward? We want to consider the cusp height, position, buccolingual position, the overall shape. Does it match and appear similar to the surrounding adjacent teeth? And also that buccal corridor, which is an important aspect of the aesthetic position. Does it flow well with the adjacent teeth? We really don't want a restoration that sticks out much greater to the buccal or is sunken into the lingual if it is important for the patient to improve their overall appearance of that restoration's position. Then from that point, once we establish all of these previous aspects, we want to think about how heavy the contact of our design is with the opposing and the proximal surfaces. I'll take you through each one of these in the design. Then we also want to consider the material thickness. Each material has its recommended thickness, and we'll review that once we get to design. And then from that point, another thing to consider is the path of insertion. Once you've established the design softwares, these digital design softwares do have a function where you can visualize your design with the adjacent teeth and your preparation, visualizing undercuts and how those may impact the seating and fabrication. First of all, the manufacturing and milling of that restoration, and then also how it may seat and potentially have hangups as you're trying it in on the patient. And then if you are making these restorations in your office, there is a sprue. It is the connection of your restoration to the block that you're milling out of. And many softwares, and depending on the material, does have an option on where you can position that sprue to hold your restoration. And you do need to consider that. You don't want that anywhere too close to your contact surfaces or the margins if you can help it. But there are certainly some situations where that may be unavoidable. So the first case that we're going to review, this is number 30. Patient presented with this existing restoration, full coverage restoration that had actually, you can see there's a hole on the occlusal, and the margins were just really not that great. This was a composite restoration that previous dentist had placed. And so we removed that and clean up the preparations when we prepare, and this was covered in part 1 and 2, trying to establish sharp margins and visible margins and good tissue retraction, good tissue management. Just as a review, we digitally scan the prep, opposing, and the bite. And these new digital scanners, the digital impression systems, have visibility in color or visual in color, and then you can also change it to stone. And what I'm showing here is on the left, no retraction cord use. And then on the right, I did place a retraction cord. And if you do have a scanner, and once you do have a scanner, eventually everyone's going to have a scanner, it is important to visualize the preparation in both color and stone. And I really recommend stone. Stone's often the one that most offices kind of skip over, but the stone will truly reveal whether or not you can visualize the margins. And that really is very, very important. You can see a big difference between the left and the right. And on the right, all I did was place a size 0 cord. Usually use a size 2, but I packed the cord, left it in place. And then every case is going to be a little bit different. Usually we pack a large cord and remove it for that visualization. But in this case, having it seated, I was able to see clinically that the margins were visible. And this is what you want to shoot for when you take your digital impression. All right, so let's get into the design here. I'm going to open our design software. So I'm going to focus and use Glidewell's fast design software. This is the chairside design software. It is a version of what the lab uses if you are submitting cases to the lab, but a little bit more user-friendly for clinicians and dental practices. So the very first step, we're going to zoom in here. The very first step of the design process is to identify and mark the margin. And this is why we emphasize the margin so much in the preparation and good tissue retraction. I often hear from many new offices that adopt digital dentistry and in-office CAD/CAM that, and it's mostly from the assistants, they will say that their doctors are so resistant to packing cord. But I understand it's not the easiest and most enjoyable procedure to do, but once you see the fact that we have to find the margin, and even if you are submitting it to the lab, someone is trying to find the starting point of that restoration. And if they have trouble doing that, that restoration is going to be compromised. There's just really no question about it. So the more you can visualize the margin, the more efficient this design process is going to be, and certainly improve the clinical outcome and longevity of your restoration. So it's really, really important. So as you can see on the preparation, there is already a red line that is placed. So in Glidewell's fast design software, once you open that case, the software automatically searches for the prep. It seeks out where the prep is and pre-places the margin for you. It's a AI algorithm that is quite intelligent. And just to show you, I'm going to, on the left-hand side, just hit reset. And then right below, there's a function that you can place it manually. This is called autocomplete, or I can hit margin AI on this left-hand side, the margin AI on the margin window. And as you can see, margin AI, it's seeking out where the prep is and identifying the margin. And notice how it does a pretty good job, but that's really because I spent a little extra time defining that finish line, making it a sharp finish line, and then also placing cord to displace the tissue. And then on top of that, a really good scan. So all of those aspects prior to design are so important so that you can have a smooth, efficient process once you get to design. So right here, once the margin is placed, it's not always perfect, and you'll see later on the next case that the margin is not going to be perfect, and there may be a little bit more editing that is required. So there's a couple ways that we can edit the margin. So all I need to do is hover over the line, the areas that you see in yellow, I just left click on the mouse, and then I can drag that in or out depending on what part of the margin or how it needs to be edited. So I'm going to visualize this from different views, starting off on the occlusal, getting a good bird's eye view, checking overall, does the margin line look good? But it is really important to get used to rotating your model and visualizing from different angles, both for the margin and later once the design is generated. By rotating and visualizing it, we have a digital three-dimensional model, but you can't see everything from the occlusal. And especially once you have the tissue displaced well, that margin, you may not visualize the fact that it could be over the edge. So I'm just going to move this over the side. From the occlusal, it may look like it's near the right position, but turning to the side is helpful. Now, there are different visual aids within the software that can help you. I'm going to show you a couple of them. So on the upper right-hand side, I'm going to deactivate the color. So you can also see this as the stone model. And then in the middle of the model options, there's a tool called curvature that highlights sharp edges within the software or within the model. Now, you can see there's a white edge over the top of the prep, but where we're focused on is the actual margin. So if you did create a really nice sharp margin, and I recommend at least 0.5 millimeter of reduction along these gingival margin areas so that once you reduce enough in those zones and have a nice smooth connection of that margin, you should have a really sharp finish line. And that's what the software is seeking out when it's attempting to place the margin at the very beginning. Now, I really just position and move the line to the very middle of that white zone. And again, checking it from different views, making sure I'm going to try not to rotate too quickly and give you motion sickness, but hopefully we're just looking along the margin and just checking to see if it is in that right position. All right, so there's a couple more visual aids, but I don't have a lot of time to go through all of them. But once the margin is set, before we move on to design, notice that there's a couple of arrows over the preparation, one for the occlusal, one for the buccal. These are identifying to the system what is occlusal and buccal. So as you can see, the occlusal is a little bit angled to the buccal. It is mostly toward the occlusal, but slightly to the buccal. So what I like to do is visualize this. I'm going to rotate the model and look straight down onto the adjacent teeth, using the adjacent teeth as a guide. Looking straight down on that occlusal plane of the adjacent teeth. Once I see the model in this view, I'm going to double left click on the occlusal and notice how it just shifts that arrow a little bit more to the occlusal. So that position is going to feed into the software's design algorithm to generate a nice design proposal. Once we've done that, I'm going to click on design on the bottom. And now the software is going to take over. These design systems, the design software is extremely, extremely well done by the software developers. And it's amazing that we have this ability to create these restorations right in our practice. And so here is our design. And you can see right off the bat, we have a design that fills in the preparation. And the very first thing that I recommend doing, and this applies really to any software, is to get a view from different angles, as if you were getting a crown back from the lab and you have a model for that crown, you seat it on the model, you're going to want to check it out. Does it flow? Probably what you're looking for is, does it flow with the adjacent teeth? Does it engage with the opposing? Are all the functional aspects in the right position? And that's what we can look at here as well. So I'm just going to look at it alone first with the mandibular model, and you can see how nicely it kind of is matching from the lingual. Those lingual cusps flow with the adjacent teeth. The buccal flows with the adjacent teeth. And then now I can activate the opposing model. So here on the right-hand side, I'll click on maxillary jaw. There's a little checkbox for that. And now we can see how the opposing is positioned over our design, also looking from the buccal and the lingual. And so these areas look really, really nice. And so I mentioned how on the checklist, we're looking at chewing efficiency, occlusal stability. And so that's where we get into these points that we can visualize on the occlusal. So I'm going to turn off the maxillary for a second. And you can see that there's some values. Let's not worry about the values at the moment. Let's first just kind of focus on the occlusal positions. So the occlusal positions, as you can see, this is identifying to us where or what parts of our design is near the opposing. So you can see the functional cusp of this mandibular molar are more toward the buccal, and the non-functional side, there's very little contact because, again, if I bring the model back, the opposing, can see how those lingual cusps are beyond the lingual of the upper. And that's really what we see in normal occlusion. Crossbite would be the reverse. And so we can see what zones of our design are near the opposing. Now you can increase or decrease this based off of your kind of preference for occlusion. There's different occlusal philosophies. With these mandibular molars, we often like to, or you may have heard of tripodized occlusion, where there's more 3 points of contact around a functional cusp of the opposing, or 3 or more points around one of the cusps. And it is dependent on the position of the patient's teeth. This one's a little bit more straightforward. If we wanted to make this more tripodized, I'll show you here on the left-hand side, there's a tool. I'm going to navigate to the middle here. It's called Sculpt. And there's a tool here called Freeform. I can control the size of what part of the design I'm moving. So as you can see, there's a contact area near. I'm going to remove the opposing for a second. There's a contact here, right on this triangular ridge. This is our distal buccal cusp, triangular ridge. This is our distal lingual. And here on the mesial lingual, let's say we wanted to have a more tripodized situation. We could move this over. And as we move and raise this over, we'll see a contact begin to form as we bring it closer to the opposing. And it is dependent on how far that zone is. So you're probably thinking it's looking a little funny with the height of this triangular ridge from the mesial lingual. And it is true. So in some situations, maybe we don't want to create that situation. So you may have an occlusal scheme in your mind and wonder why your lab didn't create that for you or generate it for you. But until you can actually see the design on your own, maybe you might change your mind and recognize that, okay, maybe we're going to have a different type of occlusal scheme. Maybe we'll just maintain two. There's wear on the opposing that limits the ability to accomplish that type of occlusion. So in this case, I'll just lower this a little bit, but I just wanted to show you that you can modify this if you wanted to. And that's why it wasn't there initially. But having the software on your own, you are given the freedom to make these changes if you choose to. All right, so now I'm going to remove the maxillary model. And as you can see, there's a contact position on the distal marginal ridge, a little bit of feather contact on that mesial marginal ridge. I've heard of clinicians wanting to avoid contact on the marginal ridge, but I don't mind that. You know, I don't mind having a distribution of forces. So if we look at the model again, just notice that we have the upper first molar, upper second premolar. So we've got 3 and 4, and we've got really well-distributed forces. We want to have and even out the forces as much as possible instead of just having a single point of contact. And that's where it could lead to occlusal trauma or potentially, occlusal trauma that could lead to excessive forces being placed on your restoration or the opposing. And we certainly want to avoid as much of that as we can. So as you can see, the design automatically does place a really good proposal based on this clinical situation. And every situation is going to be a little bit different. On the third case, I'm going to show you how that's going to be a little bit more challenging to establish our occlusion. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. So once our design, we've looked at the chewing efficiency, occlusal stability. You can make modifications if you need to there. The cusp-fossa relationship is great. The buccal cusp of our mandibular molar fits into the fossa of the opposing really nicely. That's wonderful. Now let's look at the broad contacts on the proximal surfaces. The initial placement of the contact, not bad, pretty centered with the adjacent teeth. And the broadness of the contact will be dependent on if you're next to a premolar or even a anterior tooth where it's going to be much smaller, or in this case, from the distal, we've got our second molar contact. The fast design software here from Glidewell has a really cool feature. So I'm going to open this contacts window. And on the bottom of this contacts window, we can actually define the broadness of our contact. We could use tools like the freeform that I just showed you and just pull the design over, but there's an automated way that we can do this. And so on the bottom of the window here, I'm going to choose edit mesial spot. Let's look at the edit mesial. And what it does is it brings us to a straight on view of our mesial neighbor. And notice the lighting within the software. It shows you exactly the surface that's facing our restoration. But I'm going to rotate this down so you can visualize this surface first. The software identified that area as the contact area, but let's make this a little wider. Let's make this a little wider from buccal to lingual. But before we do that, just to show you, we left click and hold and just draw a contact. But before we just draw it, you might think this is great, a nice broad contact. But if you draw it too wide, notice how it does extend to the buccal a little too much. If we leave it there, the software is going to wrap around and hug that adjacent tooth. And so we want to try to avoid that. So it's a good idea to visualize what part of that adjacent tooth is facing your design. And sometimes we can't make an extremely broad contact just due to the limits of the adjacent teeth or the shape of the adjacent teeth. And this brings me back to preparation. As you're preparing for a restoration, full coverage, partial coverage, whatever it is, doesn't matter. You want to also verify that you have good surfaces over the adjacent teeth that you can design to. And especially if there are, you know, we've all kind of nicked the adjacent tooth before on preparations. If you did, smooth that out. If there's a irregular surface with a direct restoration, we know how hard it is to get a good contact surface with direct restorations. Just smooth that out. I'm not one to really remove amalgam restorations if they're nicely sealed, but sometimes those contact surfaces can be a little bumpy and irregular. So I just use a fine grit diamond and with a low speed, just lightly smooth those surfaces out. So if you have a nice smooth surface adjacent to your prep, it's going to be much easier to generate a nice design to a nice convex surface from your restoration. All right, so I'm going to make a nice broad contact. Now, when we make a broad contact, we also don't want to bring it too far down. I talked about bringing it too far to the buccal and lingual. We don't want it too far down because the height of contour of the adjacent tooth is going to be a little bit higher. So the widest point of the adjacent tooth. If we bring that contact below the height of contour within the undercut of the adjacent tooth, that could also lead to some issues during the seating of our restoration. So we want to just keep this generally around the widest point, that height of contour, not too large, broad enough to that surface that's facing your design, but also not too low as well, where it could potentially make your design go into the undercut. So I'm going to leave it there. That is our mesial surface. And now let's go to the edit distal. Let's take a look at our distal surface. And so you can see we're straight on the mesial surface of number 31. Before I just draw it, the highlight of the software is really cool, the lighting, but let's just look at it from the top, from the occlusal, visualize the surface that's facing your design, and then you can generate a better, more accurate contact surface that way. So that looks pretty nice there. So let me hit accept. Okay, now notice nothing happened yet. Nothing will happen until we hit fixed contacts. This will automatically define those surfaces. But before I do that, the final thing with the contact I want to mention is there are values over, you see there's 3 values on the design. So there's one on the mesial, one on the distal, one on the occlusal. So this is indicating how heavy those surfaces are in contact with those areas. Every system is going to be a little bit different. Every system, every design software. So if you adopt a design software, you're probably going to start a little bit heavier. And then the beauty of digital is you can gradually dial it down. So that's what we have our users do. The default settings are -200 for the occlusion, 30 and 30 on those proximal surfaces. And then in increments of 10, you can adjust it greater or less, depending on whether or not you have to make a lot of adjustments to your restoration once you're going to try them in. And this is also dependent on if you get a good scan of the adjacent teeth. What we often see with digital scanners in the lab are missing surfaces of the adjacent teeth. So if you're missing those zones, it's going to lead to an inaccurate contact surfaces. So you might mill a restoration with 0, as you see here, several times and have no issues, but then another restoration you mill at 0 and then it's very heavy. There's a good chance that maybe that surface wasn't scanned or the adjacent surfaces weren't scanned very well. All right, so these numbers here, these are the numbers and values that I like for my restoration, my system based off of my calibration. Every system might be a little bit different. Again, even within the same ecosystem, the same CEREC, the same 3Shape scanner, the same Glidewell mill, everyone might be a little bit different. So we have our recommendations and it is up to you and your preferences as to how you want to establish that contact. So these values that I'm showing here, don't just use it for your system. Even if you have the Glidewell system, you may want to modify it a little bit. This is just what I have found based off of milling a chairside Bruxer restoration where I have very, very minimal adjustments. But if you had a change that you wanted to make, that's also in this contacts window. You can increase or decrease. Notice how these values are showing what is on the design itself. You can set the default values within the software so that each future restoration will provide the same contact strengths that you see here for that consistency. All right, so I don't have to change my values. I just wanted to go through the fact that these numbers are what works for me and on your system in the future, or if you have a system at the moment, it may be a little bit different. Now, once I hit fixed contacts, the software will automatically adjust those areas. So it's going to expand or contract the surface if we're trying to lighten the contact and raise or lower the occlusion. But all we did here, the only main change that happened was the software made a broader contact with those adjacent teeth based off of the contact area that we just drew. And the occlusion at -350, you may be wondering, why is the occlusion not at 0 like the adjacent teeth? The negative value is simply what we have found to not require a lot of adjustments because it's factoring in the dynamic compression of the teeth, and it's also the machining of the restoration itself. So it's just kind of compensating for those factors. You could start off at 0, but it's going to be very, very heavy. This is where once I mill it, it is actually within contact. And sometimes I still need to touch up a couple spots, a very light polish to remove any heavy interferences. But otherwise, this is the zone that I like my designs to be at. All right, so once the contacts are set, I mentioned earlier about making sure the embrasures are also more open. So something that I like to just double check is viewing that occlusal embrasure. And within the software, if I notice that the marginal ridge is right up against the adjacent tooth and there's very little opening, so we're wanting to have sort of like a small V shape at that occlusal embrasure. So if I don't really see that, then I'll take a tool called Smooth. I'm going to go back to Sculpt here, Smooth, and then I can control the size and then just lightly, I can also control the strength too, but notice how above this contact area, we actually want a little bit of a space. We don't want the contact all the way up to that marginal ridge junction, that occlusal proximal surface junction. So here it's a little bit close, just using Smooth, just open that up a little bit. It's okay that the contact is below it, and in fact, we want that. These openings also allow for the passage of food to the buccal and lingual while the patient is chewing. So this will also lead to a more open space where it's easier for you to pass floss through during the cleaning of the cement, and also for your patient to clean those zones during their regular hygiene. Hopefully they are flossing. All right, so once the occlusal surfaces are set, those occlusal embrasures, I mentioned emergence profile. That was kind of evaluated at the initial when we looked at the design. The emergence profile is heavily dictated by your margin and your preparation. Wherever that margin is, that's where your design is going to emerge. Now, if you have a more periodontally involved situation, or you're trying to expand or close a diastema, especially in the anterior, you might want to consider dropping that margin down a little more apically, because if you drop it more apically, that emergence profile has a chance to emerge much lower from the gingival areas so that you can create a design from that position, much lower. If your margin is kept higher, you can imagine if it's a higher margin, if you wanted to close a space, then the design has to do more of like a ridge lap, and it's just a little bulky, strange kind of emergence profile. So keep that in consideration. I like to try to keep the margins more supragingival if at all possible, but take into account what you're trying to accomplish with the restorative situation, especially for aesthetics. All right, aesthetic harmony. I mentioned how wanting to visualize it with the adjacent teeth, and that was also kind of done at the beginning, just seeing, does it flow with the adjacent teeth? And on the next case, I'm going to show you a little bit more, since it is a premolar, how important that is. So we set the occlusal contacts. In the software, I have a material thickness. So the software does prioritize establishing the correct material thickness. And I'll show you here, when we look through the crown, I can make the crown a little bit more translucent. You can see there is a red shell. And if the design encroaches on that minimum thickness shell, it will reveal a red zone. So just to show you what that looks like, I'm going to use this freeform tool and just move the design in. And now you can see the red shell form. So it is really important. The two biggest issues that the lab sees is an under reduction, especially on the occlusal, or poor tissue management, where it makes it really, really difficult for the lab to find the margin. So those two areas, if you can focus on it during the preparation, it will make it much easier for yourself if you're designing, and certainly for the lab at the moment. So you can see on the occlusion, since I had pretty good reduction on the preparation, we have a pretty comfortable zone if we needed to lower this occlusal surface. Now, just to show you, I can really take things off track here, and especially if you're learning the design, you might accidentally, especially if you go to rotate, which happens often, you mean to rotate the model and then you accidentally pull the design in a way that you didn't intend to. There is an undo on the upper left here. Most design software should have it. So once we hit undo several times, you can see it will backtrack and get things right where hopefully it should be. Okay, at this point, before we send it off to the mill, there is an option to visualize your path of insertion. So here on the left-hand side, within the Glidewell Fast Design software, it is back on the margin section. So I'm going to go to the margin tool, upper left. And on the margin window, there is an icon on top for milling and insertion direction. So this shows you, this green arrow is now identifying the insertion direction for this restoration. So the insertion direction is essentially how this crown is going to seat onto your prep in a way that minimizes the undercuts on your preparation. And also you can visualize over the adjacent teeth. So just to show you, if I move this insertion direction more to the buccal, notice how there's a red zone forming on the lingual. And so what that means is, I'm going to rotate to view from where that green arrow is pointing to. It now means that there's an undercut or a zone that's hidden from the system. And so let's say we milled it this way. There's going to be a much more open area on the lingual between your restoration and the prep. And so that's why the software attempts to minimize the undercut automatically. So if I hit auto, you can see that original position where there is no undercuts on the preparation. I don't always have no undercuts, but just fortunately, this case is a good visual where it doesn't. But this just shows you in any direction how that can impact the undercuts over your prep. Now, in an extreme situation, if I keep moving it this way, that undercut will eventually cover the margin, and that's visualized there by the red. So that means from this view, there is a hidden margin, and that could be compromised, or that can compromise the milling of the restoration. It would lead to an open margin. And so you do need to consider that for your design. And there are undercuts over the adjacent teeth too. That's the final thing I want to touch on for this case. As you can see, there's little curtains over the adjacent teeth showing where those undercuts are. And these adjacent teeth don't really have steep undercuts. I can hide the model. And just to show you, I can bring the design back. And now you can see if those proximal contacts have any areas under the curtain or within the undercut of the adjacent teeth, that could impact the seating of your design. So let's say I've milled a lot of restorations at 0. There's minimal to no adjustments. Then suddenly I have a restoration also milled at the same values where suddenly it was getting hung up. I can come to this insertion direction and see maybe there's an area of the mesial or distal surface that is within the undercut. If it's wider than the height of contour of the adjacent teeth, it will get hung up on that zone. So it is a nice thing. If you are taking control of your design, you mill out a restoration, you can come back and see if you had trouble seating a restoration, did your design encroach within the undercut of those adjacent surfaces? All right, so that is the first case. I'm going to jump into the second one here. I'm going to open number 2, and let's get back to this. And so for the Glidewell system, this is a chairside Bruxer now. Bruxer now stands for no oven weight. And that essentially means this process of milling zirconia chairside is very unique. It mills it in a fully centered state. So zirconia needs to go through several hours of centering time. And depending on the system, there is a chairside system or systems that have fast firing cycles where it mills it in a softened state, and then you can fire it chairside. But this system tries to simplify that by milling it in a fully centered state, the only one that is available. And that just makes things more straightforward. It's 30 to 40 minutes of mill time. And then from the mill, you can go ahead and seat this restoration. And that's what we did here. More retentive prep, and we'll cover cementation in a future session. But we used a resin modified glass ionomer if you have a more retentive prep. But if you are needing to bond it, we'll review that in the future. And so that's what we did here, nicely polished. And I think this blends in. It does fit what we were trying to accomplish, improving the patient's form and function. And then the aesthetics, really, once you position the tooth well with the adjacent teeth and the opposing, the aesthetics just kind of falls into place. All right, the next case that I want to review with you, this is number 12. Could be 12 or 13. Patient had one of the premolars removed for ortho. You can see there is a space. So the patient's chief complaint is a gap with her restoration. And so you can see there's a gap on the buccal. The original restoration is more edge to edge, but notice as we move more distal, it goes from edge to edge to a crossbite situation. And then she's in normal occlusion where the uppers are beyond the lowers on number 11 forward. So on this premolar, if we can try to establish a good buccal cusp overlap, we're going to try to do that. So not only is there a gap at the buccal cusp, but there's also a gap on the mesial contact there. So we can certainly close that with our design. Now, some things I just wanted to review as far as removing the old restoration. Most of these all ceramic restorations are bonded in. So that certainly is a greater challenge when it comes to removal. So I normally make a slot on the buccal, occlusal, down to the lingual margin. And then I also make a little slot from mesial to distal, little cross, trying to bless the tooth. Hopefully things work out well when we go to remove it. Now I make a little cross at mesial to distal reduction or slot is intended for me to position this is a Christensen crown removal tool or crown removal. We're going to place it from mesial to distal and just give it a little bit of force twisting action so that I want the restoration to break off to the buccal or lingual. I'm trying to minimize the forces generated mesial distally. Before I would just make the slot from buccal, occlusal, lingual, and then I'd have this removal tool position along that dimension from buccal to lingual. And as I twist, the forces are more applied to the adjacent teeth. And I ended up fracturing one of the adjacent teeth by doing that. So since that point, I started making this buccal, occlusal, lingual, and then this mesial distal slot on the occlusal so that when I twist, it minimizes the force against those adjacent teeth. Hopefully that's something you can all avoid if that hasn't happened to you. Now the preparation using a round ended tapered diamond, trying to drop those margins at least equigingivally, especially in the aesthetic zone on the visible sides of the tooth. If it's on the lingual, if I don't have to do it, I won't, but I just drop it on the buccal so we have a cleaner transition, hidden transition from our prep to the design to the restoration. So here's our final prep from the buccal and lingual. All right, let's look at our design here. And I know we're kind of coming up on time, so I'm going to try to move through this a little quickly. So again, the margin is pre-placed. Notice how the mesial buccal lingual looks really, really good. On the distal, where it's going a little bit subgingival, maybe not quite as great of a separation between the hard and soft tissue, that's where it gets a little confused. It kind of starts jumping around, and maybe the margin's not the smoothest either. But I'm going to go ahead and make a little change here. And just to show you the second way that I can edit the line here is I can double click on the line and then just draw. I'm going to actually move it off here. It's a little too close. So I'm going to double click on the line, a good spot, and then I have the ability to customize the margin placement. And so once I connect back to the line, the software automatically changes that segment to the new position. All right, so once the margin is set, again, trying to visualize it from different angles, and the occlusal direction looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and hit design and see what the software provides for us. Okay, had a little blackout on my screen here. So now this is the initial design. And notice how we have a flat occlusal, kind of similar to that original restoration that was placed. And let's look at this more in an upright position. Let's look at it actually how it looks on the patient, and then we can bring the mandible here. Because it's more edge to edge, that's why the software generated the design in this way. Now, if you aren't in communication with your lab, or if you don't have control of your design, your lab's probably just going to make this for you. But I am going to attempt to bring this buccal surface forward. So now we're taking into consideration not just improving the function, but the aesthetics too. I want to try to avoid this, especially on the molars. If you have this situation on the molars, is edge to edge on the buccal, there's a very high likelihood or increased likelihood of cheek biting. So if we can create some sort of overlap, whether that's actually cross bite or trying to bring some sort of displacement between that buccal cusp tip position, either bringing it more buccal or lingual. So I'm going to go to that freeform tool, sculpt on the left. I can control the size of what I'm moving. Usually I like to start off with a larger size and then dial it down from there if I need to. And so what I'll do, I'm going to hide the mandible. And let's look at this first from the occlusal. I need to bring this buccal cusp to the buccal just slightly. And so when you visualize your design, you can look at the adjacent teeth as you're doing this so that you're not going too far away. Obviously, this would look really strange. So we're just trying to find a point where it's balanced with the adjacent teeth, but trying to accomplish this overlap that we're trying to establish. All right, so I bring it forward. So this tool is heavily view dependent. So from the occlusal, I'm bringing it to the buccal. And then now if I rotate to the side, now this tool from this buccal view will bring the surface down. All right, so now I've created a better looking cusp shape. I've brought it to the buccal. Let's look at it. Let's look at it with the opposing. Let's see if we cleared that mandibular position. And we cleared it pretty nicely. Let me just bring this in a little bit. Now, as we make these changes, and since we're in this aesthetic zone with the premolar, we also want to try to visualize this. How does this flow with the adjacent teeth? So I think that this is brought out a little bit too much. So let me bring this in slightly. I can look at it from both the mesial and distal. Just a little overlap. And then from the contour, from the emergence profile, sometimes we can cheat a little bit by bringing these zones out just to create more of this lingualized slope. But I'm just going to leave it here and just move this down a little bit just to have a nice shape to this premolar. I'm not even worried about the contacts at the moment. So now that I've done that, let me go ahead and define our contacts. I know it's a little heavy. The software provides feedback on any change that you make. Let's go to our contacts window. Let's go ahead and define our contacts. So I'll go to edit mesial. Since we're up against a canine, our contact area is a little bit smaller. And with anteriors, it's going to be a little bit more kind of a vertical zone. But again, we have a premolar next to a canine. So it is also dependent on that premolar shape as well, where it's not quite vertical, like if we were up against the lateral on the mesial side. So, but this is the area of the canine that is facing our premolar. And let's look at the distal contact. Let's make this a little broader. Okay, let's go ahead and accept that. And now I have my values defined. Let me hit fix contacts. The software will broaden, expand. It's going to leave the shape of that cusp, but it lightens the cusp down to the value that I've preset. So see how it maintained that overlap. So I think just, you can imagine from a distance, we are improving on the aesthetic position of that tooth. So that is designed for this case. Let me go back to the presentation and let's look at this restoration. This case I milled out in obsidian. This is a glass ceramic, a lithium silicate ceramic from Glidewell, very similar to Emax. Notice we've established the overlap. But when we went to show the patient, you can kind of tell from her eyes, she's like not loving it. And what is she seeing with this case is the space on that mesial cusp slope on the buccal. You see the little gap there, that dark space between that mesial occlusal embrasure and the opposing. She wants that area closed. So even though we've made a more anatomical form of that premolar, because of the positioning of her teeth post-ortho and missing premolars, this is a occlusal black triangle that she really wasn't too happy with. So what we did is, back to the design, I had to make another one. So back to the design, all I did was use the freeform tool, even though this goes against everything I've learned about premolars and the proper shape and contour. I did this. I'm just bringing this mesial marginal ridge down to close that triangle. I can only go so much, but sometimes you have to cheat a little bit. And this is this is one of the amazing benefits of having the control in your office. So I bring this down. Let's just go back to the contacts. I've obviously made some spot heavy, so I can just give that a click. It's going to lighten the area that I just brought down. But now I have this area much more closed, and we remill this design. So let's go back and take a look at our case here. We go from that to that. So the second obsidian crown that we make, notice how that mesial margin ridge is much lower. Here's a side-by-side comparison, and that ended up satisfying the patient in a nice way. So you have to take that into consideration. It is important before you seat and deliver, bond these restorations in, especially in the aesthetic zone. You have to let the patient take a look at it and allow us an opportunity to modify it if possible. And this is one of the things, if you are reliant on the lab, you have to send the patient home, provisionalize them, submit for a remake. And while Glidewell is great with a no-fault remake policy, we'll certainly redo that for you. But if you have the control right in your office real easily with that tool, you can make the change on the fly at that moment. One of several amazing benefits of having an in-office design. All right, let's see. It is already 10 o'clock. I have this final case, but maybe we'll save it for another session because I do want to review some anterior.
Dr. Shi, you can go ahead because
Yeah.
there really aren't that many questions to handle afterwards. So if you want to take
Okay.
another 5 minutes or so. Go ahead.
All right. So this case here, this is number 30. Another lower molar. Patient had an existing all ceramic restoration. It's not seen here, but the margin of the lingual actually chipped off. So we prepared this. It is endo treated. Notice the size 2 cord placed just below the margin. I don't want to bury that. We want to keep that relatively high because we're looking for that lateral displacement of the tissue. Do a little bit of a buildup, and you can't see it here, but it actually craters down into the cavity. So this is done to try to mill. I'm really just trying to test the system and see if it will mill a buildup with the restoration, which it does. But let's take a look at it in the design. So let me open the third case. All right, this one's going to be a little bit more interesting or challenging as far as the occlusal scheme goes because of, you'll see the patient's occlusion. So here is the margin, and here you get a better visual of the space there. We could certainly build that up, and this is something, you know, we could discuss as far as doing a complete build up, and this is one of the things that chairside mill users like to do in some cases is mill the buildup with the restoration. I'm going to modify. Notice this area on the mesiolingual where there's less separation of the tissue. That's why the margin went off a little bit. So all I have to do is modify this. I'm going to bring it right up to where the tissue meets the tooth and modify the margin. And that looks much better. Okay, so the margin's set. Let me set the occlusal arrow and let's go to design. So from that point where the margin is, software is evaluating the adjacent teeth. And what the AI algorithm is actually doing is it's looking at several number 30s from what the lab has created, millions of designs of a number 30. And in this case, you can see based on this clinical situation, notice this design looks a little funny. It looks lumpy, not really the most anatomically correct design. And I wonder why that is. It's probably because of the opposing. So let's bring the opposing out and notice what's going on. So this patient's upper first premolar, notice how it's lingualized. Let's look at it from the lingual. Notice how rotated that is. Patient's occlusion is really crazy. So same with number 3. It is also slightly lingualized, and that's resulting in this collapse on the buccal and just sort of this distortion on our design. Now we can try to modify this distortion, or the software has an option, and most design softwares have this option where you can just take a library tooth and position it. And that's what I'll show you here. So I'm going to go up to this section is called Proposal Design Options. I'm going to go to Library, and within this section, it will allow me to set a library tooth in place. So I'm going to hide the opposing. I'm going to go to Adjust here. This section lets you position the library tooth based off of the prep size. And it seems challenging, but it really isn't. You just take an already pretty much perfect anatomical tooth, and then you can see how, if you position it toward the occlusal, how it engages the opposing. And this is that functional aspect that I mentioned at the beginning. So even though it's real heavy at the moment, I just want to start off with a basic library tooth. So I like this position. We can set the size, angle, and general position over the prep. And so this is defining that initial starting point. So once we hit apply, notice how this does look much nicer, but now we have to factor in and customize this library tooth to fit the space. So the AI got a little confused. It is a very tough situation, but now we can modify these zones. So just to show you, there's actually something else that we did here. We scanned the patient's preoperative tooth. So the patient had that existing all ceramic restoration. Let's just look at that existing or previous restoration to the opposing, and let's just see if we can, you can choose to copy that. So we could actually take a copy of that preoperative condition, that preoperative or previous crown, or we can, and modify it from there, or we can just start from new. So I think that we can improve on the way that crown is interacting with the opposing. So that's the pre-treatment. We can look at that at a future time, but let's look at our crown here. So what I like to do, I'm not even worried about the proximal contacts at the moment. That was an accidental pull there. So what I'll do is, since it's real heavy here, I'm going to use this freeform tool and just lower, because of, again, this is not the ideal cusp-fossa relationship. Ideally, this buccal cusp is positioned to the buccal of this mesial buccal cusp on this molar. But based on this clinical situation, I'm just going to lower and relieve this occlusal position a little bit here. And again, maximum chewing efficiency for this patient by positioning the cusp slightly toward the buccal of number 4, it's going to allow them to function a little bit. Even though it's not optimal, it will allow them to chew much better. Now, how about the distal buccal cusp? It is somewhat in the right position. It's just a little heavy. So let me rotate to this zone. I'm just using freeform just to show you that manually it's not even that bad. I just need to lower and reduce the heaviness of that. And so now, sorry, the adjacent or contralateral side is kind of getting in the way. So now we can see this zone here. Do we want to raise that? Maybe we want to take it a little bit higher so that there's more coverage with the fossa, if we can get near the fossa of the opposing. But again, you can't go too much. Of course, you can if you wanted to, but based on the situation, you have to kind of figure out a balance based off of the right anatomical position for the hopefully better occlusion for the patient. Now, how about the lingual side? So in normal occlusion, like number 2 has, notice how the lingual cusp of number 2 is in the fossa of 31. We don't have that here on number 30. Could we establish that? Not really, due to the rotation. We would have to seriously raise this side up. And maybe in some cases you can. So let's just say I raise or increase the size. Let's just see what that looks like. So let's raise these lingual cusps, and it's getting close. Maybe want to raise the occlusal surface a little higher, and eventually it will show us when the contact is established. So if we wanted to engage the lingual, which is technically the functional side, but it really is what's within function and contacting, can you establish that type of occlusion? So I know it's more of a manual approach for this molar, but this is just giving you a visualization. No occlusal philosophy out there has been written to satisfy the requirements for this type of case. So you really have to take the general anatomical form that the software provides you, which is a 5-cusp mandibular molar, And then how can you best engage that anatomical shape with the opposing? And so you can see these tools, they're giving you an opportunity. We went from fewer contacts or fewer and heavy contacts to now we've kind of distributed a little bit now along the mesial to distal on the buccal, our functional side, and maybe a light engagement on that distal lingual. Okay, so now let's go and take a look at the broadness of our contact on the mesial and distal. Let's widen that on the mesial. Let's widen the distal. Maybe a little bit too wide. We can just redo it. And I'm going to hit fixed contact. So now the software taking the positions, all those changes that I've made, preserving them, but now lightening the contact. And there is our occlusion. So this is something to take into consideration. You don't have to stick to what the software gives you. You have the freedom to modify it if you choose to. All right, let's go and take a look at our final restoration for this case. That was the final design that I ended up with for the actual case. And in 35 minutes, the milling system made this centered zirconia. You can see the cavity, the buildup milled in that. What I wanted to say was for an endo-treated tooth, maybe you don't want that thick of a layer of zirconia in case you had to re-access that tooth for whatever reason. So I just did it just to show that the system can do it, but it can be certainly very challenging. You can imagine you send this off to the endodontist for a retreatment and they're just going for days trying to get through that zirconia layer. But this is bonded in. This is the final, just a light polish and a nice improvement to the fit for that restoration. All right. Now I'm going to check back in with Dr. Park to see if there are any questions.
Oh, we got questions. We got questions and we got comments.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So this is not really related to milling in the office, but if you have a patient that has a history of fractured cusps, would you provide that information in the lab? Is there any kind of design modification that you would request based on that history?
Well, I would first try to figure out what is going on. Does the patient need an occlusal appliance? Would they benefit from deprogramming and a different approach, a different rehabilitation, a full mouth rehab? Those are all good questions. Of course, let's say the patient is unable to financially or for whatever reason. That may not actually help the lab much. I think it's
I mean, one of the things you might want to do, because it's probably not fractured in function, it's probably fractured in parafunction. So
Correct.
that would be something where you might want to consider a night guard or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Okay.
I think protecting the teeth after the fact is an important discussion to have with the patient.
Right. You showed how the software using the AI does a really accurate job of marking the margins. We have a listener who's wondering, well, how accurate is the mill in reproducing your design?
Oh, it's extremely accurate. I want to say it's within 20, 30 microns of what you are digitally designing. So margin positions, contacts, overall dimensions. I use the system for virtually everything, anterior, posterior, partial, full coverage, and it is right on the money. As long as you give it a really good, clean margin, the fit of the restorations is very, very great.
Great. And early in the lecture, you were talking about the interproximal contact values, and set based on what your preference is. And one of the .io users says that he likes to aggressively smooth those contact areas, so he sets those values on 40. So he's got some room to polish off. Thought that was an interesting comment.
Yep, there's quite a few of them. Yep, no problem.
Yeah.
And everyone has their preference, and you have the flexibility to use it
right,
however
to
you
kind
like.
of fine tune it for yourself. And we did have
Sure.
there's quite a few users that are giving us some good information. So here's one from one of your .io users wants to know that he's had some milling times that were more than 50 minutes on several cases. What is the reason why you would have a longer milling time?
Yeah, longer milling times could be due to more irregularity in the preparation. There's been some cases where I had furcation involvement where the system, I marked the margin and to provide kind of a barreling of the furcation. It does slow down in those zones along the margin. Dr. Manolili actually had one go for an hour last week, and it was due to that focal involvement. So when the system has more of a rough surface on the preparation to try to adapt the restoration to, it can extend the milling time. So the more
So
smooth
those
your
cases
restoration
where
is, the
they're kind of
less time
milling
it.
the buildup. Yeah, I'm sorry. Those cases where they're sort of milling the buildup at the same time they're milling the crown, would those take longer, you think?
So surprisingly for this one, it didn't, but because I tried to smooth everything out, the more smooth and rounded your angles are, the easier time the system will have. If you have more sharp angles, if you have retention grooves or irregularity, and it can just kind of slow down that milling strategy.
Okay. We had a lot of questions about the technique you have for removing old bonded crowns. And I don't know if are you able to pull that up and maybe kind of show that? I think you had a short video,
I
had a
did.
couple of requests for that. And
Sure.
then a question about what was the diamond, what size diamond was used for that?
Okay, let's see here. Okay, let me share the screen again. So this here,
Yeah.
you're asking the size diamond to make the slot.
Yeah, well, you made the big, did you use the same diamond for the big buccal and lingual grooves as you do for the mesodistal slot?
I did. Yeah, this is it looks like a coarse grit. I want to say that's an 856-018 or 016. It's probably one of those, which means at the shank it's 1.8 millimeters or 1.6, somewhere around there, but obviously it tapers down probably closer to 1.2, 1.3 at the tip. So
And do you make your grooves right to the tooth structure?
yes, I try to, definitely. Try to get down to the tooth structure so there's an easier chance of separation.
Okay. Well, good. So I got a question here about grooves, boxes, and shallow pinholes, and asking if it's captured in the digital design. So I guess the first question is, it has to be captured in the scan, right? First of all, in order to get into the design software, and then can you design crowns that fit into grooves, boxes, and shallow pinholes?
So that's a tough one. We recommend not to. So even within the lab, if you have a groove, like a retention groove, anti-rotational groove, depending on the size of it and the parallelism or in lack of divergence, the lab may actually fill that in, block it out digitally, or if labs are using stone still, they may wax into it, because it makes it much more challenging on the CAM process, the milling of the restoration. And it could lead to a hang up. It could affect the seating of the restoration. So depending on the size, sometimes we inadvertently create a groove in the restoration or prep when we prep off a previous crown or something. So if you do have one, the best thing is to have it more rounded. So if there's any sharp transitions on the prep, try to round those over. And if you can, if they're parallel, try to make them a little more divergent. Right. So wider near the occlusal. That will improve the chances of the system milling it out properly.
Right. So don't make any GV black sharp boxes, because your restoration will not fit there. For
trying to avoid that. Absolutely.
Great. All right. Here's an interesting question. Can this particular software that you showed us today, can it be used for 3D printing of restorations as well?
It's not designed for that, but the software does export the designs as an STL, which you can then import into your 3D printed software. So yes, you can.
Okay, got it. And somebody's reminding us, don't do your buildups with zirconia or the endo community will put a hit out on you. I think it's a very
good point.
Comment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, here's a good one. Can you compare Bruxer now with lab processed Bruxer? Right. So the Bruxer now is milled in a sintered form, and the lab is milling in a pre-sintered form and then sintering. How does that change as far as the material itself, fracture, finish, things like that?
So the physical properties are the same. The formulation of Bruxer now chairside and the lab made full strength Bruxer are the same. The only difference is a lack of staining glaze and coloring that the lab provides. But as far as the overall centering, cycle, strength, physical properties, they're all exactly the same. Those blocks have received the same heat treatment, and the mixture is exactly what the lab has used for the blocks that they mill out, again, for the full strength. And there is a aesthetic version too, which we can get to in the future, but those formulations are the same.
So here's another one. Recently had a tour at Glidewell, and the milling machines that you guys have are 5 to 6 feet tall. What's the difference between what we have in the office and the amount of reduction and versus the commercial milling machines versus the in office? And is it 5-axis versus 4-axis? I mean, what is the difference between those machines?
Yeah, the axes, it's a 5-axis within the lab, and those lab-made mills are designed to mill large, anything from a single, we call them automation blocks. They're really small blocks for individual restorations, or a large puck. So you can do a puck for a full arch, longer bridges, and the extra axis allows for more unique situations or more challenging situations for the milling system to create. The chairside system at a 4-axis does create really the majority of indirect restorations, at least tooth-borne indirect restorations that you can imagine. And it was specially designed for milling sintered zirconia and to have a small footprint for the office. The lab-made one is just built in a way to accommodate for the more difficult and extensive milling that the lab does and the number of units that they do.
Got it. That's right. They mill many more units than you do in your office.
Absolutely.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Justin Chi. Another great lecture. Dr. Vila is telling us that it's time to quit, so we're gonna quit. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Thanks to our panel. And as always, we'll see you back next week when we'll have, as always, our business advisory panel. And our guest speaker will be Dr. Sam Lau, who I consider one of the finest teachers in the world of periodontology. His topic is using lasers in restorative dentistry. Dr. Chi knows him. He's done some training for us here. And he's a true expert. He's taught lots of restorative dentists to use lasers. So we'll meet back here next week, same time, and we'll see you then. Take care. Thanks, Dr. Chi.
Thank you.